There is a ship that has crossed more water than almost any vessel in human memory, and yet no timber of her was ever cut, no keel of her was ever laid, no hand ever drove a peg through her planking into a rib of oak or pine. She has no wreck lying in silt for divers to find. No harbour keeps a record of her arrival or her leaving. And still for close to 3,000 years, she has sailed on, carried entirely on the breath of listeners and the memory of poets, from the wine-dark waters of the Aegean to the shelves of nearly every library on earth. She is the ship of Odysseus, and she may be the most famous vessel that never touched the sea at all. It is a strange thing to sit with, and so we will sit with it slowly. Somewhere in the long, unrecorded centuries after the fall of a real city called Troy, a story began to take shape about a king trying to sail home. He was clever, restless, and endlessly delayed, and the vessel that carried him became, in time, one of the most vivid ships in all of literature. Narrow-hulled, dark-timbered, driven by oar and by sail, crewed by men whose names we can still recite. Millions of readers, across dozens of languages and thousands of years, have pictured her prow cutting through the waves. Poets have described her rigging. Painters have set her against burning sunsets and storm-dark skies. And yet, if you asked any historian to point to her, to show you a plank, a nail, a rib of timber that could be said with confidence to belong to this ship, they would have nothing to show you. Not because the evidence was lost, but because there may never have been evidence to lose. She is a phantom of literature, verified by no one, known to nearly everyone. This is the paradox we begin with tonight, and it is worth letting it settle rather than rushing past it. In an age that so often insists on evidence, a coin, a shard of pottery, a line of an inscription, here is a ship that has outlasted empires, outlasted the very language in which she was first described, and she has done so purely as an idea. She belongs to that rare category of vessels that exist more powerfully in the imagination than any ship of iron or oak ever could in the physical world. To ask what she looked like is to ask a question that has no single answer, only centuries of careful, loving guesses. The world that gave us this ship is itself half legend and half remembered fact, and untangling the two is part of the work we will do together in the hours ahead. The story is called the Odyssey, and it tells of a king named Odysseus, ruler of a small rocky island called Ithaca, who fought for 10 years at Troy and then spent 10 more years trying to find his way home. Along the way, his ship, or rather the fleet of ships he commanded, dwindling one by one across the telling, passes through storms, past monsters, along coastlines that shift between the recognizably real and the entirely invented. It is, on its surface, an adventure. But beneath that surface lies a question that has occupied scholars for centuries. When, exactly, is this story supposed to be happening, and when was it actually made? The Odyssey presents itself as describing events from what we now call the Late Bronze Age, a period roughly 3,200 to 3,000 years before our own time, when the Mycenaean Greeks were building palaces at Mycenae and Pylos, trading across the eastern Mediterranean, and, according to both legend and some archaeological evidence, engaged in conflicts with cities on the coast of what is now Turkey, the region where Troy is believed to have stood. Well, this was a world of bronze weapons, of palace bureaucracies keeping records on clay tablets, of ships that carried copper and tin, wine and oil, across surprisingly long distances for people we sometimes imagine as primitive. It was a real world, and pieces of it have been recovered by archaeologists over the past century and a half in the ruins of palaces and in shipwrecks resting on the floor of the sea. But here is the complication. and it is one this whole story rests upon. The Odyssey as we have it was almost certainly not written down, perhaps not even composed in anything like its final form, until several centuries after the Bronze Age world had already collapsed. Most scholars place the poem's composition somewhere in the 8th century before our era, a period we call the Early Archaic Age, following a long dark interval in which writing itself had been lost across Greece and palace civilization had crumbled into something much smaller and more fragmented. The poem looks backward, across that gap of silence, toward a world its own audience could no longer fully remember, glimpsed only through fragments of older songs passed down by voice, generation after generation, changing slightly with each telling. This means that the ship of Odysseus, whatever she may have been, is not simply a product of one time or one mind. She is layered, the way old paint is layered on old wood, with details from a real Bronze Age past, mixed together with details from the very different world of the poet who eventually gave the story its lasting shape, a poet, or perhaps a tradition of poets, we call Homer. Some elements in the poem's description of ships do seem to preserve genuine memory of Bronze Age vessels, features that later Greek shipbuilders no longer used. Other elements almost certainly reflect the ships that the poem's own audience, centuries later, would have recognized from their own harbors. The ship of Odysseus, in other words, may never have been one single real vessel at all, but rather a composite, an idea of a ship stitched together across time, the way memory itself so often stitches together things half-remembered and things half-invented. And so we arrive at the question that this whole telling will sit inside, gently, without rushing toward any full certainty. What would this ship have been if she had existed at all? What would her hull have looked like, rising from a beach on some rocky island coast? What wood would have been chosen for her keel? What rope for her rigging? What shape would her sail have taken as it caught the wind off the Aegean? We will not answer this question the way we might answer a question about a ship whose timbers we could touch. Instead, we will hold it carefully, turning it over the way one turns an old coin whose engraving has worn nearly smooth, trying to make out a shape rather than demanding a photograph. This is not a story of discovery, in the way that the recovery of a sunken hull from the seabed is a discovery. It is, instead, a story of reconstruction, of piecing together what a ship at the edge of history and legend might plausibly have been, using real wrecks that have been found, real language preserved in ancient poetry, and the slow, patient work of archaeologists and historians who have spent lifetimes trying to draw the line between what was remembered and what was imagined. It is a story about absence as much as presence, about a vessel that exists more fully in words than she ever could in wood. Before we go further, settle in, if you like, and let the evening carry you along with us. This is the first ship in what will be a longer voyage through the great vessels of the past. And if that kind of quiet company is something you enjoy, you are welcome to stay with this channel for the ones that will follow. For now, let us return to the world that shaped this ghost of a ship, a world of bronze and clay tablets, of palace kings and long sea routes, a world half real and half remembered, out of which a poet, or many poets speaking with one voice, first raised the shape of a hull that would never need to touch water to be believed in. Before there could be a poem, there had to be a world, and that world was real in a way that is easy to forget when the story it produced has grown so large in memory. The centuries we now call the Late Bronze Age Aegean, stretching roughly from the 16th to the 12th century before the Common Era, were not an age of myth to the people who lived through them. They were an age of measured grain stores, of taxed harvests, of scribes pressing signs into wet clay, of kings who ruled from thick-walled citadels and counted their wealth in bronze, in cloth, in oil, and in the labor of those bound to serve them. It was a world built around a scatter of powerful centers: Mycenae with its lion-crowned gate, Pylos on its gentle western coast, Tiryns with its cyclopean walls, Thebes in its fertile plain, and across the sea on the Anatolian shore, though its own people knew it by another name now lost to us, or preserved only faintly in Hittite records that speak of a place called Wilusa, allied and quarreled with in turn. These were not simple chiefdoms scraping by on subsistence. They were palatial societies, meaning that a single fortified center organized much of the surrounding land, its farms, its workshops, its stores of oil and wine, through a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to require written record. The clay tablets, recovered from Pylos and Knossos, written in the script scholars call Linear B, are not epic poetry. They are inventories. They list chariot wheels, amounts of wool, offerings to gods whose names would still be recognized centuries later, rations issued to female textile workers, and, here and there, the ships and the men assigned to naval duty along the coast. It is a mundane kind of record, and that is precisely its value. It shows a world that ran on lists, not on legends, a world where the palace scribe mattered as much to daily life as any war leader, and where the sea was not a stage for adventure, but a resource to be managed, like any field of grain. And it was, in every sense that mattered to these palaces, a maritime world. The Aegean is not kind to those who try to live by land alone. Its coastlines are cut with bays, its interior broken by mountains, and its islands are scattered across water in a way that makes the sea not a barrier, but the easiest road available. Trade routes threaded between Crete, the Cycladic Islands, the Greek mainland, Cyprus, the Levantine coast, and Egypt, carrying copper and tin toward the furnaces where they would be alloyed into bronze, carrying finished bronze tools and weapons back out again, and the countless small luxuries that palace elites used to display their standing. This was an economy that could not exist without ships, and so ships, though they rarely appear as heroes in the surviving records, were everywhere in practice, beached on shingle shores, tied at modest stone piers, rowed out from coastal settlements whose names time has mostly erased. War, too, moved by water. The tablets from Pylos mention watchers posted along the coast and rowers mustered for service, suggesting a defensive fleet organized with the same bureaucratic care as the harvest. Raiding, and the fear of raiding, seems to have been a constant feature of life in this world, and later Egyptian records speak of seaborne raiders sweeping down on the eastern Mediterranean in the era when these palaces were failing, groups referred to only as peoples of the sea, their origins still debated by historians. Their ships, a source of ongoing argument among those who study the reliefs carved to commemorate the battles fought against them at the mouth of the Nile. It is tempting, faced with this scattered evidence, to reach for the certainty of a wreck, and the archaeological record does offer a handful, though fewer than one might hope, and none quite so obliging as to answer every question we might wish to ask of them. The wreck found off Cape Gelidonia, sunk with a cargo of scrap bronze and the tools of what appears to have been a traveling metalsmith, gives a glimpse of a small trading vessel going about its unglamorous business. More telling still is the ship that sank off Uluburun on the southern coast of what is now Turkey, sometime in the 14th century before the Common Era, a vessel we will return to later, laden with copper and tin, ingots, glass, ivory, and goods drawn from a dozen different lands. A floating cross-section of the very trade networks the palace tablets describe in their spare administrative language. These wrecks tell us about cargo with a precision no poem could offer. What they cannot tell us, not fully, is what the hulls themselves look like above the waterline, how they were rigged, how many oars they carried, or what a war fleet of these ships looked like massed together on a beach. For that, the evidence turns visual rather than physical. Seals carved in hard stone, showing narrow vessels with high curving prows, fragments of pottery painted with rowers bent to their work, and, most vividly, a wall painting recovered from the Cycladic island of Thera. Preserved by the volcanic ash that buried the settlement there in the same centuries, this world was flourishing. That fresco shows a procession of ships, oared and sailed, moving between painted shores crowded with figures and animals, and it remains one of the fullest pictures we have of what a Bronze Age Aegean vessel might have looked like in full sail, dressed for a formal occasion rather than caught in the ordinary business of trade. Even this, though, raises as many questions as it answers, since a ceremonial fleet painted on a wall is not the same as a warship built for a 10-year siege, and scholars continue to debate how directly the image can be applied to the ships that any historical fleet bound for Anatolia. Piece all of this together, the tablets, the wrecks, the frescoes, the scattered seals, and a world does emerge, though it emerges in fragments, like a mosaic missing half its tiles. It is a world of real kings ruling from real citadels, of real trade routes carrying real cargo across a real and often dangerous sea, of real fleets mustered for real wars against real neighbors whose names have mostly not survived. It is not in itself a world of gods walking among men, of ships that speak of a decade-long siege fought over the loyalty of a single stolen woman. That is the shape memory gave it afterward. And here lies the gap that matters most to the ghost ship at the center of this story. The palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns did not simply fade. They collapsed over a span of decades around the 12th century before the Common Era, for reasons still argued over by historians. Drought, internal unrest, the disruption of trade networks, the pressure of those same raiding peoples of the sea, or some tangled combination of all of these at once. Writing itself was lost in the collapse. The scribal tradition that produced the Linear B tablets did not survive to record what came after. What followed was a long stretch of centuries with far less material wealth, far less monumental building, and so far as the record shows, no writing at all. A period historians once called a dark age, though many now prefer language that allows for the quieter. It was out of the far side of that long gap, centuries later, once writing had returned to Greece in the form of a new alphabet, borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders, that the poet or poets we call Homer began to shake the traditions that had drifted down generation to generation. Through singers who had no palace archives to consult and no living memory of the world those archives once recorded. What reached them was not history in any careful sense, but a kind of inherited glow, half-remembered place names, a lingering sense that the age of their distant ancestors had been grander and stranger than their own. Fragments of formula and phrase passed mouth to mouth across centuries. The ships of that lost Bronze Age world, real vessels once counted and taxed and rowed by real men whose names filled real ledgers, had by then become something closer to legend even before the poet ever opened his mouth to sing of them. It is that space between the world the tablets describe and the world the poem imagines, where the ship of Odysseus first began to take a shape no timber ever held. No one who has ever gone looking for Homer has come back with much to hold. There is no house, no grave, no signature carved into stone, no contemporary who mentions meeting him, no student who claims to have learned at his knee. There is only the name, attached to two poems of such scale and unity that later Greeks assumed a single towering genius must have made them, and attached also to a dozen contradictory legends about where he was born, whether he was blind, whether he was even one man at all. 7 cities claimed him as their own, which is itself a kind of admission that no one truly knew. and the claims tell us more about civic pride than biography. Smyrna said he was hers. Chios said the same. Some ancient writers placed him close to the Trojan War itself, as though he might have heard the story from men who fought it. Others placed him centuries later, a distant inheritor working from little more than rumor and verse. The gap between these guesses spans hundreds of years, and no amount of scholarly ingenuity has closed it. What survives is not a man, but a name attached to an achievement, and the achievement itself carries the marks of something built by many hands across a very long time, however much later tradition wanted a single face to put to it. This uncertainty is not a modern embarrassment to be explained away. It is, in fact, the most important fact about how the ship of Odysseus came into being at all. The poems we call the Iliad and the Odyssey were not written in the way a modern novelist writes, alone at a desk, inventing a fictional hull plank by plank from nothing. They were composed and recomposed for centuries, within a tradition of oral performance, sung by generations of poets who never wrote a line down, who instead carried entire epics in memory and reassembled them fresh at every telling, using a vast stock of inherited phrases, rhythms, and formulas that could be fitted together like the timbers of a ship whose frame had already been cut by someone else long before. A poet in this tradition did not compose from silence. He drew from a deep well of language, already shaped by hundreds of years of use, phrases worn smooth by repetition, the way a ship's rail is worn smooth by generations of hands. When such a poet needed to describe a hero boarding his vessel, or oars striking the sea, or a ship drawn up dark upon the sand, he reached for lines that had likely already been sung 1,000 times before he ever sang them himself. Lines that had passed through countless throats and countless nights around countless fires long before they reached whichever poet or poets we now gather under the single convenient name of Homer. This manner of composition means that the poems are not a snapshot of one moment, but something closer to a sediment, laid down in layers over a very long stretch of time, the way silt gathers on a river bottom, season after season, until the deepest layers no longer resemble the ones now settling on top. The world the poems describe is not one world, but several, pressed together and made to look, through the poet's skill, like a single continuous picture. Details in the epics point unmistakably backward toward the Bronze Age world of Mycenae and Pylos and Knossos, a world that had already collapsed and vanished centuries before any version of the poems we now possess took final shape. Other details point just as clearly toward a much later Iron Age world, the world of the actual singers who kept the tradition alive after the palaces fell silent, a world of different weapons, different burial customs, a different relationship between kings and their people. The poems hold both of these worlds at once, without apology, without any apparent awareness on the part of the tradition itself that it was stitching together fabrics woven centuries apart. It is only the modern scholar, with an archaeologist's spade in one hand and a concordance of Homeric vocabulary in the other, who can begin to tease the layers apart and see the seams. Consider what this means for the ships that sail through these poems. A single vessel described in a single passage might carry, without any contradiction, the ancient audience would have noticed, features that belong to genuinely different centuries. The poems remember faintly and imperfectly the great oared galleys of the Palace Age. Vessels built for kings who commanded labor on a scale the later Iron Age world could no longer imagine. Ships tied to the same administrative machinery that produced the tablets counting oarsmen and timber in Pylos. But the poems were kept alive, generation after generation, by singers who had never seen such a ship, who lived instead in a leaner world of smaller communities and smaller boats, and who could only describe what they imagined a great Bronze Age hull to have looked like using the language and technology familiar to their own more modest age. Every retelling was, in this small way, a kind of quiet mistranslation, an attempt to render a vanished grandeur in the only vocabulary the singer actually possessed. Multiply that mistranslation across dozens of generations, hundreds of performances, countless singers, each making their own small, unconscious adjustments, and what survives by the time the poems were finally fixed in writing is no longer a description of any one ship from any one century. It is a composite, an accumulation, a vessel built not of oak or pine, but of memory folded upon memory, each fold obscuring and altering the one beneath it. This layering explains why the ship of Odysseus resists every attempt to pin it to a single, coherent design. Scholars who have tried to draw her as a naval architect might draw a real hull, find themselves constantly frustrated because the poem does not describe a single consistent vessel so much as it evokes one. Gesturing toward size and grandeur through formula and epithet, rather than through the sort of technical specification a shipwright could actually build from. The poet reaches again and again for the same small set of inherited phrases: the black ship, the hollow ship, the swift ship, the many-benched ship, words chosen as much for the way they fit the rhythm of the line as for any precise information they convey about the vessel's true form. This is not a failure of the poem. It is simply how oral composition works. A singer under the pressure of live performance, holding an audience's attention across hours of continuous verse, cannot pause to invent a wholly original description for every ship that appears. He reaches instead for the formula that fits the meter, the epithet that has always accompanied this particular kind of moment. The phrase his own teacher used, and that teacher's teacher before him. The result is a ship built largely out of repetition, out of inherited verbal timber cut and shaped long before the poet who finally sang the version we now read ever took up the tradition himself. And yet, formula alone cannot account for everything the poem gives us, because threaded through these inherited phrases are details that feel startlingly specific, moments where the poet seems to be reaching not for a stock phrase, but for something closer to genuine memory or genuine invention. With stones, the particular manner of lashing a mast, the particular silence of a harbour at dawn before the ropes are cast off. These are the moments where the composite nature of the ship becomes most visible, where memory of a real and vanished Bronze Age practice seems to surface briefly through the formula, before submerging again beneath the next inherited line. The ship of Odysseus, in the end, is neither pure invention nor pure memory, but some braided combination of both, with formula serving as the thread that binds fragments of true and half-true recollection into something that could be sung night after night. Without ever once being written down until centuries after the age it claimed to describe had already turned to dust and rumor. It is this braiding, memory, invention, and formula, pressed together across generations of singers whose names history never recorded, that gives the ship her peculiar power. She is vivid precisely because she is not fixed, precise because she is not exact, and she has outlasted every ship that was ever actually built in her image, because she was never built to satisfy a shipwright's plan at all. She was built to satisfy an audience's ear across centuries long before anyone thought to ask what timber she was made of. To listen closely to the Greek in which Odysseus' ship is described is to notice almost immediately that she is rarely described at all. She is named again and again by a small cluster of recurring words, words that return with the regularity of a tide, and it is in that regularity, not in any single vivid passage, that her character resides. The poems do not pause to draw her lines the way a modern writer might pause over a coastline or a face. Instead, she arrives to the ear as a bundle of sound, an epithet fitted to the meter, doing its quiet work of scansion long before it does any work of description. This is the first thing a careful listener must accept about her, that the language built for her was, built in large part, to fill a line of verse, not to fill in a plan. The most common epithet is maligna, black, so that she is, again and again, the black ship. Known as maligna, the words falling into the hexameter as naturally as a wave falling against a hull. Scholars have long debated what this blackness meant in practical terms. It may refer to pitch, the dark resin smeared along the seams and strakes to keep the sea out, a detail entirely plausible for real Bronze Age and early Iron Age vessels whose planks were caulked and sealed with exactly such substances. It may refer to the tarred ropes and cordage common to ancient rigging. It may simply be the color the hull took on after seasons of exposure to salt, sun, and smoke from the hearth fires kept aboard. Or it may be something closer to atmosphere than paint. The ship as a dark shape against a paler sea, a silhouette of a small vessel is on a wide horizon, black, because everything that is not sky or wave appears, at a certain distance, as a kind of shadow. The truth is probably some braid of all these things, but the poem does not care to specify. Black ship is not a technical term. It is a sound that fits the line, a color that satisfies the ear, and a mood that satisfies the story. All at once, without ever quite committing to a single meaning beneath it. Beside maligna, stands coilus, hollow, so that she becomes also the hollow ship, an epithet that at first glance seems to promise something more architectural, a description perhaps of an open hold, a vessel built without a full deck, her interior visible from the rail down to the bilge. This reading has some support in what little is known of the era's actual ship design, since many early vessels of the Eastern Mediterranean were indeed largely open, undecked, or only partially decked, their cargo and rowers exposed to the sky in a way that later, fully planked ships were not. And yet hollow, too, does a second kind of work that has nothing to do with hull form. It carries an undertone of vulnerability, of a vessel that can be filled or emptied, that holds men the way a bowl holds water, precarious and exposed. The hollow ship is a ship that can be lost. She is a container for lives, and the word never lets the listener quite forget it. Then there is the ship as swift, thoe or well-benched euzugos, or many-benched polysygos, epithets that gesture toward oars and rowing benches, toward speed cutting the water, toward the physical labor of men pulling in rhythm beneath a mast that may or may not have been raised. These words are often taken, understandably, as the closest thing the poems offer to a technical description, evidence that the vessel was oar-driven, multi-benched, built for speed rather than bulk cargo. And there is likely some truth folded into that reading. But even here, the poetic economy asserts itself. Swift is also simply a virtue word, an epithet of praise fitted to whichever ship needs praising in that particular line, regardless of whether her particular voyage that day was swift at all. Homer's ships are swift even when they are becalmed, well-benched, even when no bench is described being sat upon, because the epithet belongs to the type, to the class of thing being invoked, a ship, any ship, the ship as an idea, more than it belongs to the specific vessel of that specific moment in the story. This is the deeper truth that a close reading eventually surrenders to. These formulas were never meant to be blueprints. They were meant to be building blocks. And the builder was not a shipwright, but a singer, working without a script, composing aloud, verse by verse. before an audience whose attention had to be held in real time. Oral composition of this kind depended on ready-made units of phrase, epithets, whole formulaic half-lines, stock scenes of launching or beaching or rowing that a poet could reach for instinctively, the way a shipwright reaches for a familiar tool, fighting them into the metrical slots of the hexameter without having to invent fresh language for every ship in every line. Nos melina fits a certain rhythmic space perfectly. Nanus glaphora. The hollow ship, again, in a slightly different shade of the same word, fits another. The poet reached for whichever phrase the meter demanded at that instant, and the result, repeated across the vast scale of the Iliad and Odyssey, is not a technical manual accreted over time, but a kind of sonic furniture, arranged and rearranged, verse after verse, night after night, performance after performance, long before anyone wrote a word of it down. This is why scholars, cautious ones especially, resist the temptation to read these epithets as engineering specification. It is tempting, understandably, to take swift and hollow and black and many-benched and stitch them together into a composite whole, to imagine that if only the words are gathered carefully enough, a true design will emerge, waiting beneath the poetry like a fossil beneath rock. But the formulas do not accumulate that way. They repeat instead of building, they return instead of progressing. And a phrase used for Odysseus's own ship in one book is used without alteration for an enemy's ship, an ally's ship, a ship glimpsed once and never again in another. The vessel described as black and hollow in one passage is, elsewhere, simply a ship, unadorned, because the line did not require decoration at that moment. To read this as a set of contradictory technical claims is to misunderstand the register in which the poems operate. It is not contradiction, it is convenience. The convenience of a singer working at speed before an audience across an evening, or many evenings, drawing on a store of phrases inherited from generations of singers before, phrases that had already lost by the time they reached Homer or whichever poet or poets that name represents, whatever specificity they might once have carried. And so the honest position, the one most careful classicists and archaeologists now hold, is a modest one. The epithets are suggestive, not documentary. They lean toward a real world of pitch and oars and open hulls without ever confirming it in the way a shipwright's contract or a temple inventory might. They preserve in their sounds an atmosphere inherited from the world that produced them, a world where ships were dark with tar, open along much of their length, driven by ranks of rowers, praised for their swiftness, because swiftness truly mattered when survival depended on outrunning weather or enemies. But they do not preserve measurements. They do not preserve a keel length or a plank count or a mast height. They preserve instead the feeling of a ship distilled across centuries of retelling into words small enough to carry inside a line of verse, portable enough to survive the collapse of the very world that first gave them meaning. This is perhaps the most important thing the language teaches, more important than any specific claim about hull form, that the ship of Odysseus was built by ear, before she was ever imagined by eye. She took her first shape not in timber or pitch, but in sound, in the metrical needs of a poet standing or seated before a fire, needing a phrase to fill a gap, reaching for melina or koilos, or though, because it fit, because it satisfied the rhythm, because an audience listening in the dark would nod without noticing having heard that same black, hollow, swift shape 100 times before, in 100 other tales. She is a ship made of repetition, and it is precisely that repetition, inherited, worn, smooth, endlessly reusable, that let her sail through centuries of retelling long after any specific timber that might have inspired her had rotted, burned, or slipped quietly beneath the sea. And so if a listener asks what she actually looked like, the honest answer must begin with a caution. No one knows, not with certainty, and no one ever will. There is no wreck bearing her name, no shipwright's tablet describing her lines, no single image labeled as the vessel of the wandering king. What can be offered instead is something more modest and in its way more interesting, a careful reconstruction built not from her own remains, because she left none, but from the remains of the world that might have imagined her. It is an exercise in inference, drawn from scattered fragments of the real Bronze Age, laid gently over the poem's vague and formulaic language, in the hope that something resembling a plausible shape begins to emerge from the fog. The place to begin is with scale, since scale is where the poem itself offers the least, and where comparison must do the most work. Homer never gives a length in cubits or paces, never describes her beam, never troubles himself with the dimensions that a shipwright might have found essential. What he gives instead is a crew number, repeated with the same comfortable regularity as his epithets. 20 companions is the figure most often attached to the ship that carries Odysseus and his men, a modest complement by the standards of the larger war fleet described elsewhere in the poems. 20 rowers, arranged along 2 banks, or, more likely for a vessel of this early and simple type, a single bank of benches down each side suggests a hull, perhaps 15 to 18 meters in length. Narrow in beam, low in the water, built for speed, and for beaching rather than for great cargo or rough open sea. This is, it must be stressed, an estimate drawn by working backward from the number of rowers to the space rowers of that era were known to require, using proportions borrowed from later, better documented vessels. It is not a measurement. It is a guess, dressed in the language of plausibility. From length, the reconstruction moves to rig, and here the poem is at least a little more forthcoming, though still frustratingly brief. The ship of Odysseus is given a mast that can be raised and lowered, stepped into a socket and secured with forestays and a single square sail, white or sometimes described in the pale, indistinct color language typical of the era, hoisted. When the wind failed or blew against her, the poem says plainly that the men took to the oars, bending their backs in unison. The sail furled and lashed against the yard. This detail is one of the most consistent in the entire epic tradition, and it aligns closely with everything the archaeological record suggests about ships of the late Bronze Age more broadly. A single mast, a single square sail, and a bank of oars. For when the wind would not cooperate, this was not a sophisticated rig by later standards, not the multiple masts and complex sail plans of Roman or medieval ships, but a simple and serviceable arrangement suited to coastal hopping and short open water crossings, where a becalmed morning or an adverse gust could not be allowed to strand a vessel far from land. The visual evidence for this kind of ship, thin as it is, comes from a small number of sources, and each must be treated with its own particular caution. The most vivid of these are the frescoes uncovered at Akrotiri on the island of Thera, buried and preserved by a volcanic eruption centuries before Homer's own likely lifetime. Among the scenes painted on the walls of one building is a fleet of ships rendered in a flotilla procession that has been endlessly studied and endlessly debated by scholars ever since its discovery. These vessels show long, low hulls, banks of oars extended along the sides, cabins or shelters raised near the stern, and in some cases stylized decoration along the bow that may represent carved or painted ornament, perhaps eyes or symbolic devices meant to give the ship a kind of watchful presence. But the vessels appear to carry a mast, though whether under sail or simply standing bare in the scene is not always clear from the weathered paint. The Thera frescoes predate the world Homer describes by several centuries, and it would be a mistake to treat them as direct portraits of the ships later sung about in the epics. And yet, they remain the closest thing available to an eyewitness sketch of the kind of ship that could have existed in the wider Aegean world from which the poetic tradition eventually drew its raw material. And scholars return to them again and again, not because they prove anything about Odysseus's ship specifically, but because they are the best surviving evidence of what ships of that broad era and region were capable of looking like. Beside the frescoes stand a scattering of seal stones and carved gems, tiny objects no larger than a fingernail, on which miniature ships are sometimes engraved with a handful of confident lines, a curved hull, a scattering of oars. Occasionally, these objects are harder still to interpret. Their scale forces simplification. Their purpose was decorative or administrative rather than documentary, and their dates span a range of centuries, making it difficult to say with any precision which images might belong to a period close to the one the poems imagine. And yet, taken together with the frescoes, they offer a consistent visual vocabulary: long, low-oared vessels, narrow enough to be hauled up onto a beach by their own crews, built for speed rather than burden. It is a vocabulary that fits comfortably, if loosely, with the ship Homer describes, though fitting comfortably is not the same as being confirmed. One tradition in particular offers a tempting echo, though again it must be approached with hedged language rather than certainty. Later, Greek sources writing centuries after the supposed age of Troy describe a vessel type called the pentaconta, literally the 50-oared ship, a long narrow galley rowed by 50 men seated along a single bank on each side, propelled by oar when the wind failed and by a single square sail when it held. The pentaconta, as a named, standardized type, belongs more properly to the early historical period than to the Bronze Age itself, and it would be an overreach to claim that Homer's ship simply is a pentaconta transplanted backward in time. And yet the resemblance in basic principle, long, narrow, single-banked, oar-and-sail, beach-launched, is difficult to ignore, and many scholars have suggested that the poetic memory of Bronze Age vessels may have been filtered, consciously or not, through the more familiar shape of ships still sailing the Aegean in the poet's own later era. If Homer, or the generations of singers before him, had never seen a true Bronze Age warship with their own eyes, they may well have unconsciously borrowed the silhouette of the ships they had seen, layering a more recent and familiar image over an older, half-remembered one. In this way, the 50-oar tradition may not describe Odysseus's actual ship so much as explain where the poetic image of that ship ultimately came from. Not a memory preserved intact across centuries, but a memory quietly refreshed and updated by each new generation of tellers using the ships available to their own eyes and harbors. What emerges from all of this, gathered carefully and without overstatement, is a plausible outline rather than a portrait. A hull some 15 to 18 meters long, narrow enough to be hauled onto a beach by its own crew, fitted with a single mast and a single square sail for favorable winds. Propelled by roughly 20 oarsmen when the wind failed or turned against her, her bow perhaps marked with painted eyes or some other ornament in the manner suggested by the Thera ships, her stern perhaps sheltering a small raised structure for the captain or for stores. It is a reasonable shape, built patiently from adjacent evidence, and it is worth saying again, plainly and without embarrassment, that it remains inference and not certainty. No timber has been raised from any seabed bearing her name. No inscription confirms her length. Every plank of this reconstruction is borrowed from ships that were not hers, sailed by crews who were never Odysseus's men, in waters that may never have carried a vessel called by that name at all. She remains, even now, a ghost assembled from neighboring evidence, plausible, patient, and permanently unconfirmed. There is, however, one place where the ghost draws nearest to something solid, and it lies not in any text, but on the seabed off the southern coast of Turkey, near a small headland called Uluburun. In the late 1970s, a local sponge diver reported what he described as metal biscuits, with ears lying in the sand at a depth that made casual diving dangerous and sustained excavation slower still. What he had found, though no one yet understood its scale, was the most completely preserved merchant ship of the late Bronze Age ever recovered, and for anyone trying to imagine the vessel Homer's poem never describes, she is as close as the physical world comes to an answer. The wreck lies deep, along a steep, rocky slope, scattered across a stretch of seabed that archaeologists would spend more than a decade excavating, diving in careful, repeated descents that themselves became a kind of endurance test of patience against pressure and cold. What they found, timber by timber and object by object, was a ship that had gone down sometime in the 14th century before the Common Era, centuries before any war at Troy could plausibly be dated, carrying a cargo so rich and so varied that it reads now like an inventory of the entire Eastern Mediterranean's trading world compressed into a single hull. 10 tons of copper ingots lay in the wreck, shaped in that distinctive four-handled form the sponge diver had mistaken for metal biscuits alongside a ton of tin, the two metals that together, in the right proportion, become bronze, the material that named the age itself. There were Canaanite storage jars holding terebinth resin, glass ingots in blue and turquoise and lavender, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, ostrich eggshells, a gold scarab bearing the name of an Egyptian queen, ebony logs from Africa, pottery from Cyprus and the Greek mainland alike, tools, weapons, and even what appear to have been the personal belongings of the merchants or officials who sailed with the cargo. It is not an exaggeration to say that no single text from the period, however detailed, conveys as much about the actual mechanics of Bronze Age trade as this one broken hull and its scattered contents. And the hull itself is instructive in ways separate from what it carried. Built of Lebanese cedar, she was constructed using mortise tenon joinery planks, fitted edge to edge, and locked together with pegged tenons set into carved mortises, a method that produced a shell-first hull, the outer skin of the ship built up plank by plank before any internal framework was added to brace it. This is a meaningfully different approach from the frame-first construction that would come to dominate later shipbuilding traditions, in which a skeleton of ribs is raised first and the planking applied afterward like skin over bone. The Bronze Age method, by contrast, built the skin first and let it define the shape, with the frames added only after the shell had already taken form, fitted in afterward to stiffen a hull that was in an important sense already a ship before it had any ribs at all. This detail matters for anyone trying to picture the vessel imagined for Odysseus, because it tells us something concrete about the physical logic of a hull from this world, whatever its size or purpose. The pegged tenons found throughout the Uluburun wreck were driven through both the tenon and the plank into which it was set, effectively locking the joint so that it could not work loose under the flex of a hull moving through open water. This is careful, deliberate craftsmanship, the product of a shipbuilding tradition, already old by the time this particular vessel was laid down, refined across generations of trial, in a sea that punished any weakness in a joint with the slow, patient violence of waves working at a seam. The ship herself was modest in scale for a merchant vessel of the period, likely around 15 meters in length, broad enough in the beam to carry her heavy cargo low and stable in the water, propelled most likely by a single square sail and supplemented, when needed, by oars, though the wreck itself preserves no mast or rigging in any complete form, those being the parts of any ship least likely to survive 3,000 years on a seabed. What survives is the lower hull, the ballast stones, the cargo packed, as it had been stowed at the moment she went down, apparently in a storm, apparently while hugging the coastline in the manner that most Bronze Age vessels are believed to have sailed, keeping land in sight rather than striking out across open water unless the crossing was a short and familiar one. It is worth pausing on this last point because it is precisely here that the honest distinction must be drawn between the ship recovered at Uluburun and the ship imagined for the fleet at Troy. Uluburun was a merchant vessel, built to carry cargo efficiently and safely across established trade routes, low in the water, heavy with copper and tin and glass, valuable not for her speed or her capacity to carry fighting men, but for the safe delivery of goods that represented enormous wealth concentrated into a single hull. She was almost certainly not built for war, was almost certainly not designed to be rowed swiftly by dozens of men, and would have made a poor vessel for beaching quickly on a hostile shore and launching again under pressure, tasks that the poem's own language implies were routine for the ships gathered at Troy. The warfleet vessel imagined for Odysseus and his allies belongs to a different category of ship entirely, one built for speed and maneuverability rather than cargo capacity. Narrow rather than broad in the beam, low-sided so that oarsmen could work efficiently, and light enough to be dragged up onto a beach by a determined crew rather than requiring a proper harbor for anchorage. These are galleys in spirit, if not yet fully in form, ancestors of the pentacontas and later triremes that would define Greek naval warfare in the centuries after any historical conflict at Troy might have taken place, if it took place at all in anything resembling the form the poem describes. And yet the distinction, real and necessary as it is, does not make the Uluburun wreck irrelevant to the ghost ship of the poem. Quite the opposite. What the wreck confirms, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that shipbuilders of this world possessed the skill, the material knowledge, and the accumulated tradition necessary to construct sophisticated, seaworthy hulls capable of carrying substantial weight across real distances. The mortisantenon technique found at Uluburun appears with variation in other wrecks and in artistic depictions from across the region, suggesting it was not a local innovation confined to one workshop, but a shared method understood and practiced by shipwrights across a wide swath of the Eastern Mediterranean, passed down and refined across generations in exactly the way that any craft tradition matures. This means that whatever specific form a warfleet vessel took, it would have been built by people working within this same broad tradition of shell-first construction, pegged joinery and careful selection of timber for its particular qualities, cedar prized for its resistance to rot and its workability. Other woods chosen for strength where strength was needed most. The tools recovered from the wreck itself, adzes, chisels, drills, are recognizably the tools of a shipwright's kit, and their presence alongside the hull confirms that at least some element of maintenance or repair was expected even mid-voyage, that a ship of this period was understood by those who sailed her as a thing requiring ongoing care rather than a finished object handed over once and never touched again. It is this broader picture of craft, of tradition, of accumulated skill, passed from shipwright to shipwright across a wide trading world, that the Uluburun wreck offers most generously to anyone reconstructing the fleet of the poem. She cannot tell us the length of Odysseus's ship, or the number of oars she carried, or whether her prow bore any ornament at all. But she tells us, with a certainty no text can match, that ships capable of long voyages across open water were being built in this world by people who understood wood and joinery and the particular demands of the sea, generations before Homer ever composed a line. She is not the ghost ship herself. She is the nearest thing the physical world offers to proof that such a ship, in some kindred form, could have existed at all. It is somewhere in the middle of the second book of the Iliad, long before the war reaches any of its famous turns, that the poem pauses to do something almost administrative. The narrative slows, the fighting recedes, and for several hundred lines, Homer sets aside the business of gods and heroes to recite a list. Place names accumulate. Leaders are named alongside the regions that sent them. Numbers of ships are given contingent by contingent until an entire coastline of the Bronze Age Aegean has been called out as if from a roll kept somewhere in the poet's memory. Scholars call it the catalogue of ships, and it remains one of the strangest passages in all of ancient literature, not because it is dramatic, but because it is so deliberately, so carefully, not dramatic at all. It reads less like poetry and more like a census, a roster of a world that had otherwise vanished by the time anyone wrote it down. The catalogue begins with an invocation to the Muses that is itself telling. Homer, or whoever first gave voice to this passage, admits that he cannot possibly hold such a roster in his own memory and asks the goddesses of song to do what no mortal singer could, to recall who came to Troy, from where, under whose command, and in how many ships. It is an unusual moment of humility inside a poem otherwise confident in its own sweeping authority. The admission suggests that even in antiquity, this list was understood as something extraordinary, a feat of memory that strained the very idea of oral performance. Whether it was inherited whole from an older tradition patched together from fragments of regional songs, or composed as a single act of poetic ambition, the catalogue announces itself as a special kind of undertaking within the epic, an attempt to hold an entire vanished world's roster in the shape of verse. Within that long recitation, Ithaca receives its own modest entry. Odysseus is named as the leader of the men of Ithaca, same Zacynthus and the mainland opposite, and the poem assigns him 12 ships, painted with a vermilion so vivid that later translators have argued for generations over its precise shade, some rendering it deep red, others a burnished orange red, closer to the color of oxidized bronze. 12 ships is not among the largest contingents in the catalogue. Other kings send 50, 60, even 100 vessels, their fleets swollen with the manpower of larger kingdoms. Odysseus's dozen ships mark him as the leader of a modest island confederation, wealthy enough to matter, resourceful enough to be indispensable to the Greek cause, but not a great territorial power in the way that Mycenae or Pylos are presented to be. The number 12 recurs elsewhere in the poem's imagination of Ithaca. 12 ships that sailed to Troy, and, though it is never stated so plainly, a household and an island scaled to match. It is a detail easy to pass over, buried among the far larger fleets listed on either side of it, and yet it is one of the few concrete numbers the entire epic tradition offers about the world Odysseus commanded. 12 ships, some few hundred men at most, sailing out from a modest cluster of western islands to join the largest war the poem's world had ever known. The catalogue's scale is part of what makes it so strange to read. In total, it names some 29 contingents and reckons more than 1,100 ships drawn from a geography stretching across the Greek mainland, the islands. It is in effect an attempt to map an entire world through its ships and their leaders, a naval census of the late Bronze Age, if such a thing could be trusted. And this is precisely where the scholarly debate begins, a debate that has occupied classicists and archaeologists for more than a century and remains, in its own quiet way, unresolved. Some researchers have argued that the catalogue preserves an authentic memory of Bronze Age geography, a fossil embedded within later poetry. The argument rests on a curious mismatch. Many of the places named in the catalogue were minor, obscure, or already abandoned by the time Homer's version of the poem was being composed in the 8th century before the Common Era. Why would a poet working centuries after the fall of Mycenaean civilization bother naming small, forgotten settlements that held no significance to his own audience. The suspicion is that he would not, that these place names were carried forward, generation after generation, inside an oral tradition stretching back to the Bronze Age itself, preserved, not because they mattered to later audiences, but because the verses containing them had simply never been altered. On this reading, the catalogue is less a poetic invention than an inherited document, a shard of genuine historical memory smuggled into epic form, describing a political geography that had otherwise left almost no other trace. Other scholars remain far more cautious, noting that oral tradition is a porous vessel, capable of preserving fragments, but equally capable of inventing, combining, and rearranging them across centuries of retelling. The catalogue's numbers, in particular, invite suspicion. Ancient armies and fleets were notoriously prone to inflation in both memory and myth, and a poet, eager to render the Trojan War as the largest conflict the world had ever seen, had every reason to swell his numbers rather than record them with dispassionate accuracy. Some contingents in the catalogue may reflect real Bronze Age power centers. Others may be poetic invention, filling gaps in a list that needed to feel complete, needed to gesture toward the whole known world, converging on a single besieged city. The truth very likely lies somewhere between these two positions, a text that is neither pure invention nor pure record, but a blend of the two, shaped over centuries by singers who inherited fragments of a real geography and filled the silences with the tools every oral poet possessed: formula, rhythm, and imagination. What makes the catalogue matter, regardless of where one lands in that debate, is the sheer ambition of the gesture itself. Here is a poem attempting to do something remarkable, to hold, within the confines of memorized verse, an accounting of an entire world's ships and leaders. A roster of a civilization that by the time of Homer's composition had already collapsed, its palaces burned, its writing system lost. Its political structures dissolved into centuries of quiet obscurity, now sometimes called a dark age. The catalogue is in this sense an act of memory, pressed against forgetting. It gathers up names that had otherwise slipped from the record, kingdoms whose walls had crumbled, harbors whose docks had rotted, dynasties whose very language had vanished from use, and holds them, however imperfectly, inside the shape of song. Whether every name is accurate matters less than the fact that someone, generations after the world it describes had ended, still felt the need to recite it whole. There is a particular kind of wonder in imagining the audiences who once listened to this passage, performed aloud. To modern readers, the catalogue often reads as an obstacle, a dry recitation to be endured before the poem's action resumes. But to an ancient listener steeped in oral tradition and attentive to genealogy, geography, and lineage in ways modern audiences rarely are, the catalogue may have functioned very differently, as a moment of recognition, a chance to hear one's own home named among the great gathering at Troy, to hear the ships of one's ancestors counted among the fleet. For the island communities of the Western Aegean, hearing Ithaca and her 12 red-painted ships spoken aloud within this vast roster may have carried a charge of local pride, a small point of contact between a familiar shoreline and the largest war their tradition knew. The catalogue, then, was not merely an inventory. It was a kind of communal remembering, performed again and again across generations, each performance renewing a claim that these places, however small, had once stood among the counted world. And so the catalogue stands within the body of the poem as its own strange kind of vessel, not a ship of wood and pitch, but a ship of memory, built to carry an entire vanished roster forward through centuries that might otherwise have let it sink without trace. Whether its cargo is history or invention, or some inseparable mixture of both, it remains one of the clearest signs that the world behind the Odyssey was not empty. It was populous, contested and remembered, however imperfectly, by the poets who came after it. Poets straining, as Homer himself confessed at the catalogue's opening, to hold in mortal memory something too vast for any single mind, and finding in the attempt itself a kind of quiet, aching wonder. To imagine the ship of Odysseus, honestly, one must set aside the poem for a while and walk instead into a shipyard that has left almost nothing behind but timber scars, bronze tools, and the patient inferences of those who study them. No Bronze Age shipwright left a manual. No apprentice recorded his master's instructions. What survives is quieter than that, the ghost of technique preserved in wood, recovered from the seabed, in the tool marks still visible on ancient planking, in the small bronze fittings that once held a hull together and now lie corroded in museum drawers. From these fragments patiently assembled, a picture emerges of how a ship, such as the one Homer imagined, might actually have been built, plank by plank, across the shore of some Aegean harbour town, under a sun that has not changed in 3,000 years, even if almost everything else has. The heart of that picture is a technique that would have seemed unremarkable to the men who practiced it, though to later ages it would come to seem almost miraculous in its refinement. Mortis Antonon joinery, pegged planks, locked edge to edge without benefit of a single iron nail. The shipwright did not build a skeleton first and clothe it in planking afterward, in the manner that would become standard many centuries later. Instead, the hull itself was the primary structure. Each plank was shaped along its edge with a row of rectangular slots, mortises, cut with care and effort using bronze chisels and mallets of hardwood. Into these mortises were fitted small tongues of wood, tenons, shaped to slide snugly into the waiting slot of the neighboring plank. The two planks were drawn together, the tenon locking them edge to edge, and then, so that the joint would not work loose under the strain of waves and cargo, a peg was driven through a drilled hole in the plank and through the tenon itself, pinning the whole assembly fast. Multiply this joint by hundreds along a single seam and by dozens of seams along the length of a hull, and one begins to sense the sheer patience such construction demanded. A shipwright building in this manner was not assembling a vessel so much as weaving one plank interlocked with plank until the hull became, in effect, a single continuous shell strong enough to hold its shape without a heavy internal frame. This technique is not conjecture drawn from the poem alone. It is documented physically in wrecks recovered from the floor of the Mediterranean, vessels whose timbers, though scattered and incomplete, preserve the telltale mortise slots and peg holes that confirm the method. The labor such joinery required helps explain something the Odyssey itself gestures toward without dwelling on it, that a ship, in this world, was not a quick production. It was the fruit of skilled hands, working for a long season, perhaps longer, shaping and fitting each timber with a precision that left little room for haste. When the poem shows Odysseus felling his own trees and shaping his own hull on Calypso's island, the scene reads, to modern eyes almost as solitary craftsmanship elevated to myth, a single man performing labor that in ordinary life would have occupied a team of specialists for many weeks. The poet's audience, familiar with the real labor of shipbuilding, would have understood the scene as both plausible in its details and extraordinary in its compression. A hero doing alone what a palace workshop usually required many hands to accomplish. The timber itself was chosen with as much care as the joinery that shaped it. The ancient Mediterranean world drew on species suited to different purposes within the same hull, a practice that period evidence and later, better documented traditions both suggest was the norm rather than the exception. Oak, dense and resistant to strain, was favored where the wood needed to bear heavy loads, such as in keels or major structural timbers. Pine and fir, lighter and more easily worked, served well for planking, where flexibility and ease of shaping mattered more than raw density. Cypress, prized for its resistance to rot, appears often in later traditions as a preferred wood for hulls meant to endure long exposure to seawater, and it is reasonable to imagine similar preferences at work in the Bronze Age, though the sources describing that earlier period remain thinner than one might wish. Whatever the exact species chosen for a given vessel, the timber had to be felled, seasoned, and transported before a single plank could be shaped, and each of these stages consumed time that the finished ship's swift, effortless motion across the wine-dark sea in poetry entirely conceals. Once shaped, the seams between planks required more than mechanical joinery alone to keep the sea outside the hull rather than within it. Pitch, drawn from resinous trees and heated until it could be worked into a thick, dark paste, was pressed into the remaining gaps and spread along the seams to seal them against seepage. The smell of heated pitch, sharp and faintly bitter, would have hung over any shipyard actively fitting out a hull, a scent as characteristic of the trade as the ring of bronze tools against wood. Rope, too, played its part beyond simply rigging the sail. Cordage bound certain structural elements together, lashings reinforcing joints in places where a peg alone might not hold under the working of a hull in a heavy sea. The rope itself was most often twisted from plant fiber, flax being a common choice in the wider Mediterranean world, its fibers spun and laid into cordage strong enough to bear the strain of a working sail and its rigging. The sailcloth stretched above the deck was most plausibly woven from flax, as well heavy linen cloth cut and stitched into a single broad square that could catch the wind and drive the hull forward when the oars were shipped and rested. None of this labor occurred in isolation from the wider society that demanded it. A fleet, such as the one Homer catalogues, drawn from a dozen kingdoms and gathering at Aulis before its long crossing, implies not scattered individual effort, but organized production on a scale that only a palace economy could sustain. The archives recovered from Mycenaean palace centers, written in the Linear B script and dealing largely in administrative record-keeping list, among their entries references to naval matters, ships, oarsmen, and the raw materials required to build and maintain them. These records are terse, functional documents, tallies rather than narratives. Yet they confirm that shipbuilding in this world was neither a private hobby nor a purely individual craft. It was an activity organized and tracked by the palace administration. Timber requisitioned, labor allocated, oarsmen registered, in much the same bureaucratic spirit that the palaces applied to grain stores and bronze tools. The shipwright in such a system was not an independent artisan, working for whichever customer might arrive at his yard. He was more likely a specialist attached to the palace's economy, his skill recorded and his labor directed toward projects the ruling authority required, whether those projects were ships of trade, ships of war, or in the world the poem imagines, a great combined fleet meant to carry an army across the sea to Troy. Such a system helps to ground the epic's fleet in a plausible reality, even as the poem itself compresses years of labor into a handful of lines. Assembling 1,200 ships, however inflated that number may be as poetic hyperbole, would have required coordination among many separate palace centers, each contributing its own contingent, each drawing on its own shipwrights, timber stores, and coastal yards. The poem's catalogue, enlisting kingdoms and their ship counts together, may in fact preserve something of this administrative reality in poetic form, a memory however distorted by centuries of oral transmission of a world in which shipbuilding was fundamentally a palace enterprise rather than a private one. Whether or not any single fleet of this scale ever gathered at Aulis, the labor described was of a kind the Bronze Age world genuinely knew how to organize, and the ships that resulted, joined plank to plank, with wooden pegs, sealed with pitch, rigged with flax rope and linen sail, were built by real hands, using real methods that have left their trace in the mud and sand of the sea's floor. The ship of Odysseus, however much invention shaped her final form in the poet's hands, was imagined by a world that understood, in patient and exacting detail, what it actually took to build a vessel capable of carrying men across open water and, if fortune allowed, bringing at least a few of them home again. Consider, then, the moment of launching, as Homer gives it to us again and again through the long course of the poem, almost as a refrain, a kind of ritual repeated at each new departure. The ship is dragged down to the sea by the shoulders and hands of men, her keel scraping across sand or shingle, and she is set afloat in the shallows, while the mast is raised and fitted into its socket, the sail bound to it with twisted ropes of oxhide. The black hull rocking gently as it takes the water's weight for the first time in that particular voyage. There is a calm attentiveness in these passages, a lingering on the physical labor of it, the men bending to their oars, the ropes coiled and stowed, the dark wine and the meal offered before departure, as though the poet understood that a voyage does not begin with wind and current alone, but with the ordinary repeated labor of hands that know their work. The sail is often described as white, catching what wind there is, and the ship is said to run before it, the water parting at her bow, the wake spreading behind her in a long, pale line across the dark surface of the sea. When the wind fails, as it often does in the poem's world, the oars come out, and the men row in unison, the ship moving now by muscle rather than air, a slower and more deliberate progress that Homer never treats as lesser or merely functional. There is something almost meditative in these scenes, a rhythm of blade dipping and lifting, the small grunts of effort, the creak of the thole pins, the ship advancing foot by foot across water that might otherwise have held her motionless for days. It is worth pausing on this, because the modern ear, trained by centuries of steam and diesel and effortless crossing, does not naturally feel the weight of what it meant to move a wooden hull across open sea by human strength alone, hour after hour. No shore in sight and no guarantee that this labor would end before nightfall or storm. The geography through which this ship moves is one of the great unresolved questions of the poem, and it has occupied readers, poets, and increasingly archaeologists and geologists for well over 2,000 years. Some of the places Odysseus visits seem to belong to the real Mediterranean, or at least to a poetic memory of it: the coast of Thrace, the land of the Cyclades, the waters near Sicily, where the poem places the Cyclops, the straits that may correspond to the narrow passage between Italy and Sicily, where Scylla and Charybdis are said to wait. Other places belong entirely to a world beyond geography. Islands where goddesses live alone, lands where the dead may be visited without dying, floating islands that move with the wind. The poem does not trouble itself to separate these two kinds of space, the real and the invented blend, into a single continuous coastline, sailed by a ship that does not know or care which shore is historical and which is myth. And then there is Ithaca itself, home at the center of the whole voyage, whose precise location has become one of the most contested questions in classical geography. The modern island that bears the name Ithaca does not entirely match Homer's description of a low-lying island, visible at a distance behind a further one, and scholars, sailors, and amateur investigators for more than a century have proposed alternative candidates, most persistently the neighboring island, now called Lefkada. Configurations of the coastline that have shifted since the Bronze Age through earthquake, silting, and changing sea levels. No resolution has been reached, and the honest position held by most serious students of the question is that Homer's Ithaca may correspond to no single fixed point on a map, may be a composite of memory and geography reshaped by centuries of oral retelling before the poem reached the form in which we have it. The ship, in this sense, sails not toward a place we can circle with certainty on a modern chart, but toward an idea of home that the poem insists is real, without ever letting us confirm exactly where it lies. Whatever their disagreements about geography, scholars agree with some confidence on the rhythms that would have governed real seafaring in the world the poem draws upon, and these rhythms shape the ship's imagined voyage even when the destinations become fantastical. Bronze Age sailors, so far as the evidence allows us to say, preferred to keep land in sight wherever possible, tracing the coastline by day and finding shelter by night rather than committing to long stretches of open water without a shore to return to if the weather turned. This was not timidity, but sound calculation, given the limits of the vessels and the absence of any reliable means of determining position once land had disappeared entirely from view. Sailing was almost certainly seasonal as well, concentrated in the calmer months when the Mediterranean's winds behaved with some consistency, and largely abandoned during the winter, when storms could appear with little warning and no captain, however skilled, could guarantee a safe crossing. Homer's poem reflects this caution obliquely. The storms that scatter Odysseus' ships are treated as catastrophic, unpredictable, sent by gods precisely because ordinary sailors would have understood how quickly fair conditions could turn to disaster, how thin the margin was between a safe voyage and a wrecked one. Navigation itself, in the absence of instruments, depended on a set of skills passed down through practice rather than written instruction. The position of the sun by day and by night, the stars, among which Homer singles out the constellation the Greeks called the Bear, which never sets below the horizon in Mediterranean latitudes, and so could serve as a fixed point for a helmsman holding his course through darkness. Calypso instructs Odysseus when at last she permits him to leave her island to keep this constellation on his left hand as he sails, a small and specific piece of practical navigation folded into a scene otherwise concerned with longing and departure. And it is exactly this kind of detail that suggests the poem's world. However, dressed in divine intervention, remembers something true about how sailors actually found their way. And yet, for all this careful attention to the mechanics of sailing the ship, in the Odyssey is never only a physical object moving across physical water. She is also, and perhaps primarily, an instrument of transformation, carrying her passengers not simply from one shore to another, but from one state of being to another, from war to peace, from youth to age, from anonymity to recognition, from a man scattered and lost among strange lands to a husband and king restored to his own hearth. Each voyage in the poem marks a threshold crossed, and the ship herself becomes almost a threshold in miniature, the space between one identity and the next. When Odysseus is finally carried home to Ithaca, it is notably not aboard his own ship at all, but aboard a Phaeacian vessel, rowed by a crew who ask no questions and require no payment, a ship so swift and sure that it moves through the night like a well-trained team of horses, done aware even of the moment of arrival. This detail is worth sitting with, because it suggests that Homer understood the ship as something more than transport. The true return home, the poem seems to say, happens almost outside the hero's own consciousness, carried by a vessel he does not control. Arriving at a threshold he crosses without fully realizing he has crossed it, until he wakes to find the familiar shape of his own island around him. The wine-dark sea, that recurring phrase whose exact meaning has puzzled translators for generations, whether it describes color or the reflective darkness of deep water, or some quality of light now lost to us, becomes in this light less a description of pigment than an image of the sea as a substance of both danger, a surface that could swallow a man or return him transformed, depending on nothing more than the turning of a season, the favor of a wind, and the strength of the hands upon the oars. But the ship that carried Odysseus through these waters, the ship whose planks and ropes and steering oar the poem describes with such patient attention, does not survive to see that homecoming. This is one of the quieter griefs the Odyssey holds within it, easy to overlook amid the monsters and the enchantresses and the long catalogue of trials, but essential to the shape of the story the poem is telling. The vessel that left Troy with 12 ships, and the single ship that remained to Odysseus after the losses at the land of the Cyclones and the long attrition of the journey, is finally destroyed near the island of Thrinacia, and with it go the last of his companions, the men who had sailed with him from the beginning. The men whose names Homer has been careful throughout the epic to keep half in shadow, as though already marking them for a fate the audience must have anticipated even on first hearing. The account itself is told with a kind of terrible calm. The crew, starving, disobeys the warning given to them and slaughters the cattle of the sun god Helios, sacred animals grazing on an island where the poem insists more than once that nothing should be touched. Odysseus is asleep when this happens, or apart in prayer, depending on how the moment is read, and by the time he returns, the harm is already done, the meat already turning on the spits, the hides already crawling on the ground in an omen. The ship sails on for 6 days after the slaughter, the wind fair, the men eating what they should not have taken, and then, on the 7th day, the weather changes. Zeus sends a black cloud over the ship. The mast is struck by a thunderbolt and falls, killing the helmsman where he stands, and the vessel spins in the water, its timbers coming apart under a wind. The poem describes as a great tearing squall until the whole structure of the ship, keel and mast and side planking, the very thing that had carried these men across so many seas, is scattered into the water like so much driftwood. Odysseus survives this wreck, but he survives it alone. He lashes the broken mast to the keel with a length of oxhide rope that had, moments before, secured the ship's steering gear, and clings to this makeshift raft as the storm carries him back, cruelly, past the very strait he had only just escaped, past Charybdis herself, whose whirlpool nearly swallows him before releasing him again. Exhausted, into open water, he drifts for 9 days before reaching Ogygia, the island of Calypso, where he will remain for 7 years, without ship, without crew, without any means of leaving on his own. The wreck at Thrinacia is in this sense the true end of the voyage as a collective undertaking. Everything that follows, Calypso's island, the raft he builds himself and loses again to Poseidon's anger, his arrival among the Phaeacians happens to a man who no longer commands a ship, who is no longer even in the ordinary sense a captain, but simply a survivor, moving from shore to shore by whatever means the gods and the sea allow him. It is worth sitting with how deliberately this loss is constructed within the poem, because Homer had other options. He could have brought Odysseus home with a remnant of his crew, a handful of loyal men to stand beside him in the hall at Ithaca when the reckoning with the suitors finally comes. Other heroic traditions do exactly this, kept companions, surviving, retainers, witnesses to the final act. But the Odyssey chooses instead to strip its hero of every companion before it allows him to reach home. And this choice does something specific to the shape of the story. It isolates him completely. By the time Odysseus washes up on the shore of the Phaeacians, naked, salt-crusted, entirely without possessions or followers, he has been reduced to nothing but himself. No ship to mark his status, no crew to obey his commands, no visible sign of the king he claims to have been. Everything he has left is memory and cunning and the bare fact of his own endurance, and this reduction is precisely what the poem seems to want, because it is only from this stripped-down condition that the long, slow process of testing and disguise and eventual recognition can properly begin. A hero who arrived home, still surrounded by his men, still commanding a ship, would arrive already vindicated. The Odyssey is not interested in that kind of homecoming. It wants Odysseus to arrive as no one, so that becoming himself again, reclaiming his name, his bed, his hall, his wife, can be the substance of the story's second half. Read this way, the wreck at Thrinacia is not simply an unfortunate episode among many, but a structural necessity, almost a kind of narrative surgery performed on the plot. The ship must be destroyed, because the poem's deeper interest lies not in adventure for its own sake, but in identity, in what remains of a man once every external marker of his former life has been taken from him. The crew's transgression against the cattle of the sun gives the destruction moral logic within the story, a reason that satisfies the audience's sense of justice. But underneath that moral logic runs a purely structural one. The poem needs Odysseus alone. And it uses the storm and the sacred cattle and the anger of a god as the machinery to arrive at that solitude. The ship, in other words, is sacrificed not to punish the crew, though it does that too, but to isolate the hero, to clear the stage of every other actor so that the remaining books of the epic can focus with such unbroken intensity on the workings of a single mind. There is something almost ruthless in this when it is looked at directly. The companions who die are for the most part unnamed, described in aggregate, mourned only briefly before the narrative moves past them. Their deaths serve the story's architecture more than they serve any individual grief the poem lingers over. And yet this ruthlessness is also in its way an honest reflection of something ancient sailors would have recognized without needing it explained to them, that the sea does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, that a storm which begins as punishment for one act of impiety will drown the pious along with the transgressor. Once broken, takes down its whole company, regardless of merit. The randomness of shipwreck, the fact that survival often had less to do with virtue than with the accident of which timber a man happened to be nearest when the mast came down, is one of the oldest anxieties of maritime life. And the Odyssey does not soften it so much as give it a shape that could be told and retold, passed down through generations of listeners who had their own reasons to fear the sea and their own dead to reckon with. This is, perhaps, part of why the wreck at Thrinacia has endured as one of the poem's most affecting passages, even though it lacks the monstrous spectacle of Scylla or the seduction of Circe's island. It is quiet comparatively, a mast struck by lightning, a helmsman killed instantly, a hull torn apart by wind, and its quietness is exactly what makes it feel true to something beyond myth. Every ancient culture that lived by the sea carried some version of this fear within its stories. The awareness that a vessel built with such care, launched with such hope, sailed with such skill, could still be undone in a single afternoon by weather no one could have predicted and no piety could have prevented. The Odyssey takes that raw common anxiety and gives it purpose, folding it into the architecture of a hero's private trial, so that the destruction of the ship becomes not merely a disaster but a doorway, the mechanism by which Odysseus is finally fully alone and by which the poem can begin the long, patient work of bringing him, piece by piece, back to himself. The island of Ithaca has been searched, in one way or another, for as long as people have believed that Odysseus was more than a story. Long before the tools of modern archaeology existed, travelers and scholars stood on the rocky slopes of the Ionian Sea and asked a question that seems on its surface simple enough. Which island is this, really? Homer describes Ithaca with a handful of details. Its position relative to other islands, its ruggedness, its unsuitability for horses, its harbors, and for centuries, readers have taken these lines as though they were a map, folding and unfolding the text in search of coordinates. The trouble, as anyone who has tried it will admit, is that poetry is a poor substitute for a survey. The geography of the Odyssey serves the rhythm of the hexameter and the logic of the story far more than it serves any cartographer, and the lines that seem to describe a specific place with confidence have a way of dissolving into ambiguity the moment someone tries to match them against an actual coastline. And yet the search has never stopped, because the desire behind it runs deeper than any single verse. To find Ithaca would be, in some sense, to find Odysseus. To close the distance between the man on the page and a man who once stood on a real shore, looking out at a real sea, waiting for a real ship that never came. This desire reached something like a fever in the 19th century, in the decades when a handful of ambitious, self-taught investigators became convinced that the Homeric poems were not simply literature, but a kind of buried history waiting to be excavated. The name most associated with this conviction is Heinrich Schliemann, the wealthy businessman turned amateur archaeologist whose excavations at Hissarlik in the 1870s convinced him and much of the reading public that he had found Troy itself. Schliemann's methods would be considered reckless by any modern standard. He tore through layers of settlement with a speed that destroyed as much as it revealed, chasing a single golden layer that he believed matched Homer's city, while cutting through others that later scholars would recognize as equally significant. But his instinct, however clumsy in execution, spoke to something that gripped an entire century. This was an age hungry to prove that its foundational stories were literally true, that the epics, which had shaped education and imagination across Europe, were not invention, but memory, however distorted by centuries of retelling. If Troy could be found beneath a mound in Anatolia, then perhaps Ithaca could be found too, and perhaps somewhere beneath its soil lay the palace of Odysseus, the bed built around the living olive tree, the harbor where the Phaeacian ship once touched land. The candidates for Ithaca have multiplied rather than narrowed as the search has continued. The most obvious answer, the island that has borne the name Ithaki since antiquity, remains the leading contender for many scholars, and its geography has been defended and reinterpreted repeatedly to reconcile it with Homer's lines. But the fit has never been perfect, and this imperfection has fueled alternative theories for well over a century. Some investigators have proposed that the western coast of neighboring Kefalonia, a peninsula now joined to the larger island, but which some geological surveys suggest may once have been separated by a channel that has since silted or filled, better matches the poem's description of an island lying farthest out to sea, away from the others. Toward the sunset. This theory has attracted serious attention precisely because it takes seriously the idea that the coastline of the Ionian Sea has changed since the Bronze Age, that earthquakes and shifting water levels over 3,000 years could have erased a geography that once made perfect sense. Other researchers have looked instead to smaller islands, to shifts in ancient place names, to the possibility that the Ithaca of memory and the Ithaca of Homer's text are not even the same location, but different points along a tradition that drifted as it was retold across generations of singers before it was ever written down. None of these theories has produced a decisive answer. Each new proposal has its defenders and its critics, and the debate continues in academic journals with the same mixture of rigor and longing that has characterized it since Schliemann's era. What has changed, and changed significantly, is the posture that serious archaeology now takes toward this question. The 19th century hunger to prove Homer literally true, to walk into a museum and point to an object and say this belonged to Odysseus, this is the ship, this is the harbor, has given way to something more careful and, in its own way, more honest. Modern archaeologists, working in the Ionian Islands and across the wider Aegean world, are not, for the most part, searching for confirmation of a story. They are searching for context. The distinction matters enormously. A team excavating a Bronze Age site on Ithaca, or Kephallonia, today is not hoping to uncover a plaque reading "Here lived the king who sailed to Troy." They are hoping to understand what daily life looked like in that region during the centuries when the oral traditions behind the Odyssey were taking shape, what pottery was in use, what trade routes connected these islands to the wider Mycenaean world, what the harbors looked like before rising water or shifting coastlines altered them. What kind of settlement, if any, existed on a scale that could plausibly support the kind of household and community the poem describes. This is slower, less dramatic work than Schliemann's mound cutting, and it rarely produces headlines. But it has produced something Schliemann's methods could not: a body of careful cross-referenced evidence about the world in which the poem's imagined events might have occurred without ever claiming to have found the events themselves. This caution extends necessarily to the ship. No wreck has ever been found that can be tied even loosely to Odysseus or his fleet. No harbor has been excavated with an inscription or an artifact that confirms it as the departure point for Troy or the landing place of the hero's return. This should not surprise anyone who has followed the logic of the earlier chapters in this story. The poem's ship was never a specific vessel to begin with, but a composite, built from formula and memory and the accumulated experience of generations of sailors and singers. Searching for its physical remains is, in a sense, like searching for the wreck of a sentence, and yet the absence of any confirmed artifact has not stopped the search, because the search itself has never really been about the object. It has been about the boundary between story and history, and the persistent hope that the boundary might, somewhere, prove thinner than it appears. There have been moments of excitement along the way, false starts that briefly seem to promise more. Underwater surveys off the coast of the Ionian Islands have occasionally turned up ballast stones, amphora fragments, timber remains from vessels of later periods, and each discovery has, for a season, generated speculation in the press about a possible connection to Homer's world. In nearly every case, more careful dating and analysis has placed these finds centuries away from the Bronze Age, belonging instead to the classical or Roman periods when the islands were bustling with trade of their own, unrelated to the age the poem imagines. These false alarms are not failures so much as they are reminders of how densely layered these coastlines are with human activity, how many ships have sailed and sunk in these waters across 3,000 years, and how difficult it is to isolate one particular layer of memory from the accumulated sediment of everything that came after it. What remains then, after more than a century and a half of searching, is not a ship, not a harbor, not a single object that scholars agree belonged to the world of the poem. What remains is a landscape, real islands, real currents, real winds, that still blow across the Ionian Sea in patterns not unlike those a Bronze Age sailor would have known, paired with a story that continues to resist being pinned to any one point on a map. Some see this as a disappointment, the failure of 2 centuries of effort to close the gap between literature and history. Others have come to see it differently, as a kind of clarity rather than a failure. The recognition that the poem was never meant to be excavated, that its power lies precisely in its refusal to be located, and that the ship of Odysseus continues to sail undiscovered and undiscoverable. Because it was built not from timber, but from the accumulated longing of everyone who has ever wanted to know exactly where a hero once stood, waiting for the sea to bring him home. If the ship of Odysseus cannot be found because it was never a single vessel to begin with, then it becomes worth asking what vessels, real and remembered, might have lent it their shapes. No poet invents from nothing. Even the most imaginative image draws on something seen or heard described or handed down through generations of sailors who spoke of ships the way farmers speak of weather, with a familiarity that assumes the listener already knows the basic shape of the thing. The ship that appears in the poem, hollow and black and swift, did not arrive whole, from the poet's mind. It arrived from centuries of real hulls moving across real water, fleets that fought and traded and sank, and the slow process by which many actual ships can blur, over generations of retelling, into a single remembered vessel that feels more vivid than any of the ones that inspired it. The Mycenaean world, in its brief flowering before the collapse that ended the Bronze Age, built and used real war fleets. The evidence for this is not abundant, but it is enough to establish the fact beyond serious doubt. Palace archives from Pylos, written in the Linear B script and burned into permanence by the same fire that destroyed the palace, record rowers assigned to coastal watch duties, oarsmen organized by district, a bureaucracy anxious about the sea, approaches to its territory. These are not literary references. They are administrative ones, the kind of dry, practical records that survive precisely because they were never meant to be read by anyone beyond the palace officials who filed them away. And what they show, however faintly, is a society that maintained ships for defense and likely for aggression as well. A coastline watched by men whose job was to report sails on the horizon, watched by men. Depictions from this period, though rare, reinforce the impression of purpose-built naval activity. A fresco fragment from the Aegean world, damaged and incomplete like nearly everything that survives from this era, shows a procession of ships that seem equipped for more than simple transport. Their hulls lined with what may be shields, their decks crowded with figures who may be warriors. The interpretation of these images remains contested, as so much from this period does, but the general picture they support is one of organized maritime power, fleets that existed not as isolated merchant voyages, but as coordinated forces capable of carrying armed men across open water. This is, in miniature, exactly the picture the poem paints on a grander scale. A coalition of kings sending ships to a single shore for a single purpose. The poem may have inflated the numbers and dramatized the cause, but the underlying military reality of Mycenaean states capable of projecting force by sea appears to rest on genuine foundations. The raiding ships of the Sea Peoples belong to a slightly later and considerably better documented moment, though one still thick with uncertainty. In the final century of the Bronze Age, as the palace systems of the Eastern Mediterranean began to fail in overlapping waves of crisis, a loosely defined group of seaborne raiders, remembered in Egyptian sources under the modern label of the Sea Peoples, appeared along the coasts of the Levant and Egypt itself. Their origins remain debated. Some scholars connect them to displaced populations from the Aegean and Anatolia, others to a broader collapse that set many peoples in motion at once. Refugees and raiders, scarcely distinguishable from each other in the chaos of a collapsing world. What is not in doubt is that they came by ship in numbers sufficient to threaten Egypt itself, the greatest power of the age. The evidence for their vessels survives most vividly at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III on the west bank of the Nile, where relief carvings commemorate an Egyptian naval victory against these raiders with a level of detail unmatched by any other Bronze Age source. The reliefs show ships with high curving sterns and prows carved into the shapes of birds, single masts with furled or set sails, crews fighting hand to hand as Egyptian archers rain arrows down from the shore. The scene is chaotic by design, meant to convey the completeness of the Egyptian triumph. Oars broken, ships overturned, enemy sailors falling into water rendered by the sculptor as a stylized pattern of waves beneath the hulls. It is propaganda, certainly, carved to glorify a pharaoh's victory rather than to serve as a neutral maritime record. But even propaganda must depict something recognizable to be effective, and what it depicts is a real category of ship built and sailed by real crews who terrorized the Eastern Mediterranean in the last uneasy decades before the old order collapsed. These are the kinds of ships, or ships very much like them, that a poetic tradition inherited across the centuries of transmission between the Bronze Age catastrophe and the poem's eventual composition. Whether the specific raiding vessels at Medinet Habu bear any direct line of descent to the ships imagined in the poem cannot be proven, and the scholars who study both traditions are careful to note the gap of centuries and the absence of any direct textual connection. But the visual vocabulary, curved hulls, single masts, crews of fighting rowers, the sense of a ship built for both war and endurance, belongs to a shared late Bronze Age maritime culture that the poem, composed generations later, from oral material stretching back toward that same period. The ship of the poem did not need to descend from any single historical vessel. It needed only to inherit the general shape of what ships from that world looked like, filtered through generations of singers who had never seen the originals but had heard, from their own teachers, descriptions handed down like family stories, worn smooth by repetition until only the essential shape remained. Real disasters likely fed this process as much as real ships did. The Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age was a world dependent on maritime trade to a degree not matched again for centuries, and dependency on the sea meant inevitably exposure to its dangers. Ships were lost. The Al-Barun wreck itself testifies to at least one such loss, a single cargo taken by the sea in a moment, no text records, leaving behind only what the excavators would recover more than 3,000 years later. There would have been many others, storms that scattered fleets, currents that drove ships onto rocks, raids that ended in burning hulls and drowned crews. None of these individual disasters left names behind. Uwe, me, but the pattern of loss itself, the knowledge that ships and the men who sailed them did not always return, would have been common knowledge across the communities that depended on the sea, a shared anxiety pressed into the collective memory of an entire seafaring world. Over generations of oral storytelling, particular disasters likely blurred together, losing their individual details while gaining a kind of composite emotional truth. A storm that destroyed one fleet might merge in memory and song with a raid that destroyed another, until what remained was not any single event, but an archetype. The shipwreck, the return delayed, the crew scattered across islands and shores far from home. This is precisely the shape of the return voyage in the poem, a series of losses and near losses strung together across 10 years, each one plausible on its own terms, together forming a catalogue of every way the sea could take a man from his home. The poem's genius may lie less in inventing these dangers than in gathering them, drawing together disasters that had separately haunted generations of sailors and binding them into the single continuous voyage of a single remembered ship. This is in the end how the ghost took its final form. Not from one wreck, one fleet, one raid, one storm, but from all of them together, compressed by centuries of retelling into a single vessel that could carry the full weight of everything the sea had ever taken. The Mycenaean war fleet lent it purpose. The raiding ships of the sea peoples lent it danger and shape. The countless nameless disasters of Bronze Age seafaring lent it its long catalogue of losses. And the singers who carried all of this forward, across the centuries between the world that experienced these things and the poet who finally set them into lasting verse, performed the essential work of blending, taking many ships and making of them one, so that when the poem finally named her, black and hollow and swift, she carried inside her hull the memory of 1,000 real vessels that no one then or now could name. By the time the poem had settled into the form in which it would be copied and recopied across the centuries, the ship of Odysseus had already begun a second life, one that had nothing to do with keels or timber and everything to do with the imaginations of those who had never seen a Bronze Age galley and never would. The vast painters of Greece, working centuries after the world the poem described had already crumbled into memory, took up the ship as a subject with the same ease they gave to gods and heroes, and in doing so they did something the poem itself had never done. They gave her a face. They gave her a precise silhouette, a particular curve of hull, a specific arrangement of oars and sail, drawn not from any surviving memory of Bronze Age shipwrights, but from the vessels the painters themselves could see gliding into the harbors of their own age. The ships that appear on Greek pottery from the archaic and classical periods, the black figure and red figure vessels that still crowd the display cases of museums, show hulls with high curved sternposts, single banks of oars, sails set on masts with rigging that belongs unmistakably to the world of the painter and not to the world of the poet's imagined past. It was not deception. It was simply how memory works when it has no anchor. The painters were not trying to reconstruct a lost technology. They were doing what every generation after them would do, reaching for the ships they knew, the ones tied up at their own docks, and lending that familiar shape to a story that had come to them without one. This anachronism, if it can even be called that, repeats itself with such regularity across the centuries that it begins to look less like an error and more like a pattern, almost a law of how a culture retells its own founding stories. The Romans, when they took up the tale in their own poetry and in the visual arts that decorated their villas and public buildings, dressed the ship again, this time in the forms of Roman and Hellenistic seafaring, vessels with the reinforced hulls and the elaborate steering oars of a later Mediterranean world. Mosaics uncovered from Roman villas show Odysseus bound to a mast that belongs to a ship with proportions and rigging entirely of its own moment, the sirens circling a hull that no Bronze Age sailor would have recognized. The story had become old enough by then that its origins were already a matter of scholarly argument, even among the Romans themselves. And yet no one seemed troubled by the gap between the ship as imagined and the ship as it might once have been. The tale had outgrown its origins so thoroughly that its outward form had become negotiable, endlessly available for redressing, while its inward meaning, the longing, the wandering, the slow persistence toward home remained fixed and untouched underneath. This pattern did not end with antiquity. It simply slept, as so much of the classical world slept through the centuries that followed, waiting for new hands to take it up again. When the Renaissance rediscovered Homer, first through fragments and translations, and eventually through a full flowering of classical scholarship, the ship of Odysseus was reborn once more, and once more she was rebuilt in the image of her new discoverers. The engravers and painters of that era, working in a Europe newly obsessed with antiquity, but still centuries removed from any real archaeological knowledge of the Bronze Age, gave the ship the lines of the galleons and the oared galleys that they themselves knew from the harbors of Genoa and Venice and Lisbon. Paintings from this period show tall masts, elaborate rigging, castles built up at bow and stern, details drawn wholesale from the seafaring world of the 15th and 16th centuries and grafted without apology onto a story more than 2,000 years older than the ships being used to illustrate it. The result was a ship that had never existed in any single age, a composite creature stitched together from Bronze Age memory, archaic Greek imagination, Roman elaboration, and Renaissance invention, each layer laid down without erasing the ones beneath it, so that by the time later centuries inherited the image, they were inheriting not one ship, but a whole geological record of ships, each stratum belonging to a different moment of retelling. The pattern continued into the ages that followed, each with its own vision, its own confident anachronism. The Romantic painters of the 18th and 19th centuries, drawn to the same story for its drama and its sorrow, painted ships that owed as much to their own era's frigates and merchant vessels as any earlier interpretation had owed to its own world. The illustrators who prepared editions of the poem for a reading public newly hungry for classical stories rendered hulls with a confidence that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the visual vocabulary available to them at the time. Even into the 20th century, as cinema took up the tale and gave it moving images for the first time, the ships built for the screen carried the unmistakable stamp of their own moment of construction. Vessels shaped by the technology and the aesthetic sensibility of film studios, rather than by any rigorous attempt at Bronze Age reconstruction. Each retelling, whether painted, carved, printed, or filmed, repeated the same quiet act of substitution, offering its own age's most familiar vessel as a stand-in for a ship that no one retelling the story had ever actually seen. There is something worth sitting with in this recurring choice, this pattern, stretching across nearly 3,000 years of retelling. It suggests a need that runs deeper than simple ignorance of the historical facts, a need that persists even now in an age when far more is known about Bronze Age shipbuilding than any Renaissance painter or Roman mosaicist could have imagined. The story, as it has come down through the poem, asks its listeners to picture a physical thing, a ship that carries its captain from the shores of a fallen city back across a wide and dangerous sea. And something in the human mind resists leaving that ship unpictured. Story of wandering and longing and eventual homecoming seems to require a vessel that can be seen, however faintly, however wrongly, in the mind's eye, and each age has been willing to supply that vessel out of its own experience. This is not a failure of imagination. It may in fact be imagination doing exactly what it is built to do, filling a gap left by history with whatever material lies closest at hand. Because a story without any image at all is a story that risks slipping away, and the human mind would rather hold on to a wrong picture. Seen this way, the ship of Odysseus becomes something closer to a mirror than a vessel, a surface each age has turned toward itself and used to check its own reflection. The archaic Greek painter saw his own harbor in her hull. The Roman mosaicist saw the ships of his own empire's trade routes. The Renaissance engraver saw the galleons crowding his own city's ports. And in every case, the ship that emerged from that reflection told less about the Bronze Age world the poem claimed to describe, and more about the world of the person doing the imagining. Their assumptions about what a ship should look like, what a hero should sail in, what a voyage across a legendary sea should resemble, to eyes that had never left their own familiar shores. The ship, in other words, has spent most of her long existence not as a fixed historical object, waiting to be correctly identified, but as an open question each generation has answered, according to its own understanding of the sea. And in answering it, each generation has revealed rather more about itself than about the vessel it believed it was describing. This is perhaps the truest thing that can be said of a ship that never existed in any single fixed form, that her greatest usefulness has always lain not in what she was, since no one can say with certainty what she was, but in what she has allowed each age in turn to imagine, to build, and to see reflected back. There is a peculiar honesty in admitting that a ship which never existed can feel more real, more thoroughly known, than vessels whose timbers have been raised from the seabed and laid out under museum lights for anyone to touch. The Uluburun wreck is real in the way a stone is real, heavy, present, undeniable, its cargo of copper and glass and tin telling us with precision what one ship on one voyage in one narrow slice of the 14th century before the Common Era was carrying when the sea closed over it. And yet that ship has no name. No one sang of her helmsman. No one remembers the face of the man who chose her timbers, or the harbour that watched her leave, or the years she spent afterward in the mouths of those who had known her. She is real, and she is silent. The ship of Odysseus is unreal, and she will not stop speaking. This is the strange inversion that sits at the center of any honest reckoning with her, that verification and vividness are not the same currency, and a vessel can be wholly persuasive to the imagination while remaining, by every method available to archaeology, entirely unconfirmed. It is worth asking plainly why this should be so, since the answer says less about ships than about memory itself. A wreck recovered from the seabed gives us objects, a shape of hull, a manifest of cargo, the dimensions of a hold, but it withholds intention. We do not know why that particular route was chosen, what fear or hope rode with the sailors, what story they told themselves about where they were going, and why it mattered. Homer's ship, by contrast, gives us almost nothing of the object and everything of the intention. We are told she is fast and dark and hollow, but we are told at length what it meant to sail her, what it cost to lose her, what it felt like to long for the sight of her sail against a home shore. Poem supplies motive where the wreck supplies matter, and a listener constructing the vessel in the space between those words is, without quite realizing it, building something more emotionally whole than any timber recovered from below the waves could offer on its own. The ship becomes real, not because her ribs can be measured, but because her purpose can be felt. And purpose, it turns out, is a more durable kind of evidence than oak. The scholarly debate that has surrounded this ship for over a century can be summarized, in the end, without much drama, because its conclusion is not a verdict, but a description of a condition. Some historians have argued that the poem preserves, however distorted by centuries of oral transmission, genuine memories of Bronze Age seafaring, real oars, real steering methods, real anxieties about the autumn storms that closed the sailing season. Others have argued with equal patience that Homer's ship is largely an Iron Age vessel dressed in older language, shaped more by the world the poet actually knew than by any Mycenaean original he could not have seen. Still others, and this position has gained ground, rather than lost it as the evidence has accumulated, suggest that the question of an original is itself slightly misdirected, since oral epic does not preserve the past the way a sealed tomb preserves it, intact and waiting. It preserves the past the way a river preserves the mountain it descended from, transformed by every mile it has traveled, carrying sediment from many sources, recognizable in its general course, but no longer identical to its origin. Homer's ship, in this reading, is neither pure invention nor faithful record, but something harder to name and perhaps more interesting than either. A vessel built from memory that was already partly forgetting itself, even as it was being sung, each generation of singers replacing a plank of understanding here, a fitting of vocabulary there. Until the ship afloat in the finished poem was constructed quite literally the way old ships were always kept alive at sea, not by preserving every original timber, but by replacing what had rotted plank by plank, voyage by voyage, till nothing of the first hull remained, and yet the ship was still, by every reasonable account, the same ship. This is not a compromise reached reluctantly by scholars unable to settle the matter. It is increasingly understood as the actual nature of the object under study. History, memory, and myth are not separate rooms in this case, with a wall to be knocked through so the truth in one might finally be reached from the other. They are interwoven at the level of the sentence, the epithet, the formula. Homer's own hexameter, built as it is from inherited phrases passed down across generations of singers, is itself a kind of layered wreck, a hull built of timbers cut in different centuries and fitted together by ears that no longer remembered. To ask where the history ends and the myth begins in such a structure is a little like asking of a ship repaired at every port across 100 years of service, which single plank makes her real. The honest answer is that the reality was never located in any one plank. It was located in the ship's continuous use, her continuous telling, her continuous capacity to carry someone somewhere and bring them, or fail to bring them, home. What the long search for this vessel ultimately reveals, then, is not a fact about one particular ship, but a fact about all ancient ships. A fact the field of maritime archaeology has come to accept with something like humility. Every hull raised from the seabed, however well preserved, arrives at the surface as a fragment requiring interpretation. The Alubaran wreck itself, for all its treasures, is not read directly. It is reconstructed, its missing planking inferred from surviving impressions in the seabed, its rigging imagined from comparative evidence drawn from tomb paintings and later, better documented vessels. Its crew's daily life, extrapolated from cooking pots and stone anchors, and the quiet testimony of what did and did not survive. Even the most confidently reconstructed Bronze Age ship in a museum display case is in this sense partly a physical object and partly an informed guess, partly timber and partly argument. The difference between such a ship and the ship of Odysseus is one of degree, not of kind. Both are built from evidence. Both require imagination to complete what the evidence leaves open. The wrecked ship simply has more matter and less voice. The poem ship has more voice and less matter. Neither stands wholly outside the work of reconstruction, and neither should be trusted to have arrived at the present moment unchanged from whatever it once was. There is a quiet lesson folded into this, one that a listener may carry away long after the details of oar counts and steering oar positions have faded from memory. Pry that storytelling and shipbuilding at the deepest level are not so different an activity as they first appear. A shipwright takes timber that does not yet know what it will become and shapes it, plank by plank, joint by joint, according to an idea of the vessel that exists first in the mind and only afterward in the wood. A poet, working in an oral tradition stretching back centuries before a single line was written down, does something remarkably similar with words and memory, taking inherited fragments, a phrase for the sea, a name for a hero, a formula for a hull cutting through waves, into a vessel capable of carrying an audience somewhere they have never been. Both crafts work by trial across long spans of time. Both are refined by failure as much as by success. A plank replaced because it split, a phrase replaced because it no longer scanned or no longer moved the listener as it once had. Both in the end produce something that must simply hold together and do its work, carry cargo or carry meaning, regardless of whether every piece within it can be traced back to its origin. The ship of Odysseus, understood this way, was never really absent at all. She was built and she was launched, and she has been sailing continuously for nearly 3,000 years, not upon water, but upon the steady, patient labor of telling. That her hull cannot be found on any seabed is not a failure of the search. It is only proof that some ships are built to be carried in the mind rather than recovered from the deep, and that this too, humbly considered, is a form of seaworthiness. There is a place on the western coast of what is now called Ithaki, where the land dips down toward a narrow cove, and the water there is quiet in the way that water often is when it has nothing left to prove. No breakwater marks it. No stone jetty leans into the surf. If a ship of the Bronze Age ever came to rest in that cove, the sea has long since taken back every trace of the timber that once knocked gently against a shore, every rope that once looped around a rock worn smooth for exactly that purpose, every footprint of a crew unloading whatever cargo or grief they carried home. The harbour, if it was ever there, offers nothing to the archaeologist's brush. It offers only the sound of waves arriving and withdrawing, the way they must have 3,000 years ago, and the way they will continue long after every argument about Odysseus has been argued to its quiet end. It is worth standing there even if only in the mind, and letting that emptiness settle. So much of this search, for the poet, for the palace, for the ship, has been a search for confirmation for the moment when a shard of pottery or a fragment of timber might rise from silt and settle the matter. But the cove asks for something different. It asks to be looked at as it is, an inlet of grey-green water, a scatter of stones, a hillside that has watched every century pass without needing to explain itself. If a hero's ship once slid into that water, that arrival is no longer separable from the thousands of ordinary arrivals that happened there before and after. Traders, fishermen, refugees, wanderers who came ashore with no poet waiting to record them. The harbour that was never proven to be the harbour is in the end simply a harbour, doing what harbours do, indifferent to whether history noticed. And perhaps that indifference is the final, necessary lesson of this whole long inquiry. The ship of Odysseus was never meant to be verified. She was meant to be believed in the particular way that a poem asks to be believed. Not as a claim about the physical world, but as a claim about the human world, about what it costs to leave home and what it costs to return. The audiences who first heard her described around a fire or recited in a hall were not waiting for proof of her hull thickness. They were waiting to hear whether the man they had come to know through 20 books of wandering would finally see his own shore again. The ship was the vehicle for that longing. Its planks were made of expectation as much as pine. It has been said more than once across the long history of this poem's study that the ship of Odysseus is the oldest surviving vessel in the Western imagination. Not the oldest ship ever built, for surely countless craft rose and rotted on countless shores before Homer's world took shape. Every other vessel from that era has either been reduced to timber fragments consumed by shipworm and time, or exists only as a name in a tablet, a shadow in an inventory, a hull shape inferred from ballast stones on the sea floor. The ship of Odysseus alone continues to move. She has been rebuilt, again and again, in the imagination of every reader who has ever followed her course. Rebuilt in wax tablets and papyrus scrolls, rebuilt in the margins of medieval manuscripts, rebuilt on the stages of Renaissance courts, rebuilt in the oil paint of 19th century academies. Rebuilt in classrooms where children sound out her name for the first time. No wreck has ever offered that kind of continuity. No cargo hull raised from silt has ever been reconstructed so many times in so many minds without ever growing old. Consider, for a moment, the strange privilege that gives her. A physical ship, however grand, is subject to the plain mathematics of decay. Wood rots, iron rusts, rope frays, and even the most reverently preserved wreck must eventually be measured against the truth that it is only a fragment of what it once was, its missing timbers guessed at, its rigging inferred from post holes and stains in the sand. The ship of Odysseus faces no such attrition because she was never subject to that mathematics in the first place. She exists at the intersection of language and memory, and both of those mediums, unlike timber, can be renewed indefinitely, so long as someone somewhere continues the labor of retelling. Every time a new translation reaches for the right word to describe her hull gliding over the wine-dark sea, she is, in the most literal sense available to a ship of her kind, refitted for another voyage. This is not a small thing to have survived 3,000 years of human history intact. Empires that built real fleets with real timber and real bronze and real crews have vanished so thoroughly that their harbors are now indistinguishable from any other stretch of coastline, their ships reduced to a scatter of amphorae and a few corroded fittings resting in the dark. And yet a ship that may never have had a single physical plank has outlasted them all, carried forward, not by preservation in salt water, but by the patient labor of builders of an entirely different kind, poets who memorized her, scribes who copied her, translators who searched their own languages for words equal to her, teachers who read her aloud to rooms of children who had never seen the sea. It is a lineage of craftsmen as real, in its own way, as any lineage of shipwrights who ever felled timber for an actual keel. They did not work with adzes and pitch, they worked with memory, ink, and voice. But the result of their labor floats still, as surely as any hull that has ever been raised from a beach and set upon the water for the first time. It would be easy to think of this as a kind of consolation prize, the poem instead of the ship, the story instead of the wreck, but that framing misses something essential about what has actually been preserved. A physical ship, however remarkable, can only ever tell the story of one voyage made by one crew at one moment in time. It cannot speak for every sailor who has ever left ashore, not knowing if they would return, or for every family who has ever stood at a harbor's edge, scanning the horizon for a sail that might, at long last, be the right one. The ship of Odysseus, precisely because she was never bound to a single hull, has been free to become the vessel for all of that longing at once. She has carried the grief of Trojan War veterans in antiquity and the anxieties of modern soldiers returning from wars Homer never could have imagined. She has carried the patience of every partner left waiting, the wariness of every traveler who has learned that the way home is rarely as straight as the way out. No timber could bear that weight. Only an idea, tended across centuries, could be asked to carry so much and still, somehow, remain seaworthy. And so the ship sails on, without a keel, without a wreck site, without a harbor that can be pointed to with any real confidence. She sails in the quiet act of a reader opening the poem for the first time, uncertain what waits at the end of the voyage. She sails in the careful notes of a scholar comparing the language of one Bronze Age tablet to the formulas of an oral tradition centuries younger. She sails in the brushstrokes of every artist who has tried to render her prow cutting through painted waves, and in the low voice of every narrator who has tried, as this one has tried, to describe a vessel that may never have needed to exist in order to be entirely real. The tide continues to move in and out of that quiet cove on the western coast of Ithaca, indifferent to the question of whether a hero ship was ever moored there. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Some harbors are measured in stone and depth soundings. Others are measured only in the number of times a story has been carried home to shore safely by another voice willing to take up the oar. If you have found some quiet company in this long chronicle of ships that could be measured and ships that could only be imagined, you are welcome to remain a while longer. There are other vessels waiting in the dark of this channel, some raised from the seabed, some raised only from the page, and all of them, in their own way, are still waiting to be carried home.